turn to 2 Samuel 12. Let's come to 2 Samuel 12. Okay, so here sits David in his sin. He's got a son now. Bathsheba's had a son, and it looks like everything is covered over. Nobody seems to know. Now, I'm sure there was a lot of talk among the servants, particularly within the palace, because the baby, maybe came a little early, and but everything seems to be okay. But the Lord sent Nathan to David. Now, who's Nathan? Prophet. Nathan is a prophet. Nathan's a prophet. And I think it's so interesting. God, David's not really listening to God. When you're in a cover-up, when you're in a sin, you're not really hearing from God. Now, he may have thought maybe he did a little bit, but, he's really not hearing from God, so God couldn't speak to him. And yet, we read some of the Psalms, and my goodness, God spoke to David, didn't he? But not now. So David gets to hear from Nathan. So Nathan comes, and he tells him this little story. This story is so interesting. It's kind of like a little parable. He says, David, there's this man that has this little pet lamb, and his whole family loves it. It's just part of the family. And then he has a neighbor that's got a lot of lambs, a lot of sheep, rich guy. And the rich man has a guest. A guest comes to visit him. And so instead of killing one of his lambs, he goes over and kills this little pet lamb of his neighbor and brings it over and serves it to his company. So what do you think about that? Well, David is just incensed. Look at verse 5. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing, because he had no pity. I mean, isn't it easy when you're in sin to judge somebody else? Oh yeah, it's a whole lot easier to be judgmental when you've got something going on in your own heart. And now look at verse 7. Nathan said to David, you are the man. Look at those 4 words. You are the man. Whew. That's just like an arrow right to David's heart, isn't it? I mean, he knew that. I mean, there's no way you can get around what that did to David. That pierced his heart, didn't it? Look at verse 9. He says, why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have smitten Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and you have taken his wife to be your wife, and have slain him with the sword of the Ammonites. And now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me. Now, this is God speaking. And have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to your wife. That's a pretty upfront statement, isn't it? He says, you have despised the word of the Lord. The psalmist of God is now turned to really despising what God has said. Now look at verse 13. This is wonderful. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Now, David didn't have to go into a whole great big long spiel. I mean, he's caught, number one. He's caught, he knows it's been verbalized. God's known all along, and David knew that. But now he's caught, and now it's time for David to confess. And when you make a confession, it doesn't have to be a great big long thing at all. Because God knew, didn't he? David just confessed it. He said, I have sinned against God. Now look at verse 14. Nevertheless, because by this deed, let me go back. Nathan said to David, let's look at the end of verse 13. The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that is born to you shall die. And then Nathan went into his house. Now, our first thought might be, this child didn't sin. I mean, this is an innocent child. Why in the world would the child die? And I don't get anywhere that David is upset with having this child. I mean, David's had lots of children by different wives. And he's loved them all. David is a family man. We're going to see this later on. And he loved all of his children. And so why did God do that? Well, it's interesting. And you know, I've debated over that. I've kind of struggled over that sometimes. I've read that. But you know, it's interesting because the next part we see that David fasts, he prays, he goes before God. I think this is his time of private time with God, really confessing, really laying it out there, because we see a lot of his confession. And I think that what is happening here is that as God seeks the Lord, as David seeks the Lord, I mean, eventually we come to this little statement, and I'm going to show it to you down here in verse 22, because the child, of course, dies. He said, while the child was alive, now this is after the child dies, then he begins to eat. And he gets up, he washes, he begins to live a normal life again. And he said, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, who knows whether the child will be gracious to me and the child may live. See, he prayed the highest prayer of faith, didn't he? While the child was still alive, even though God said he would die. But now he